More than 40 years ago, in December 1979, Soviet troops entered Afghanistan to support a friendly communist regime and intended to leave within a year at most. However, the Soviet Union's good intentions turned into a long war. Today, this war is often portrayed as conquest, invasion, and villainy. But let's look at those events not as a military operation, but as a tragedy, and examine the myths and facts about this war. On December 12, 1979, at a meeting of the Politburo of the CPSU Central Committee, a decision was made and formalized by a secret decree to send troops into Afghanistan. These measures were not taken in order to seize the territory of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union's main interest was to protect its own borders, since the USSR shared a border with Afghanistan, and secondly, to counter the United States' attempts to gain a foothold in the region. The formal reason for sending in troops was the repeated requests from the Afghan leadership. On one side of the conflict were the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan's government, and on the other side was the armed opposition, the Mujahideen, also known as Dushmans. The Dushmans received support from NATO members and Pakistani intelligence services. The struggle was for complete political control over Afghan territory. According to statistics, Soviet troops were in Afghanistan for 9 years and 64 days. The peak size of the Soviet troop contingent in 1985 reached about 109,000, after which it steadily decreased. The withdrawal of troops began 8 years and 5 months after their presence in the country started, and by August 1988, the number of Soviet military personnel on the territory of Afghanistan was only 40,000. The withdrawal of Soviet troops was overshadowed by the disgraceful Operation Typhoon, the last operation of the 40th Army, as a result of which the full power of artillery and aviation was unleashed on Ahmad Shah Massoud's Mujahideen positions. As a result, hundreds of civilians were killed. We covered this operation in detail in this episode. Watch it if you haven't heard about it. Western propaganda portrayed the entry of Soviet troops into Afghanistan as aggression for the sake of seizing new territories. However, the West began supporting the Mujahideen leaders even before 1979. Robert Gates, who at that time was a CIA officer and later served as Secretary of Defense under President Obama, describes the events of March 1979 in his memoirs. At that time, according to him, the CIA was discussing whether to continue supporting the Mujahideen in order to draw the USSR into a quagmire, similar to what Vietnam was for the US, and the decision was made to keep supplying the Mujahideen with money and weapons. This was also confirmed by Zbigniew Brzezinski. In one of his interviews, he said, "According to the official version of history, CIA assistance to the Mujahideen began during 1980, that is, after the Soviet Army invaded Afghanistan on December 24, 1979. But the reality, which was kept secret until today, is different. In fact, President Carter signed the first directive for covert assistance to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul on July 3, 1979. And on the same day, I wrote a memo to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this assistance would lead to Soviet military intervention. The total amount of aid to the Afghan opposition from the United States exceeded $2 billion by 1988. Saudi Arabia provided the same amount of military aid to the Afghan armed opposition, and funds also came from private foundations in the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf. About $400 million annually. But war is not sustained by money and weapons alone. The West carried out several secret operations that would be useful to know about. For example, Operation Faraday. This was the code name for a secret operation against Soviet forces in Afghanistan, conducted under the patronage of the UK Ministry of Defense and the US Department of Defense in the early years of the Afghan War. Among the top priorities were the creation of training camps in Europe, including the US and Pakistan, training and deployment of American and British saboteurs from Special Forces units, organizing the supply of weapons, ammunition, explosives, and training Afghan Mujahideen in sabotage tactics. There was also Operation Cyclone, one of the longest and most expensive secret operations of the CIA. The main instrument of Operation Cyclone was chosen to be the ISI, Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence. According to various estimates, the ISI mobilized up to 35,000 foreign Muslims from 43 Islamic countries. And one of the most devious operations was Moskit, the code name of the operation to undermine Soviet troops using drugs. For this, Colombian cocaine was supplied to Afghanistan, as well as opium and heroin were used. And here are some facts about other countries. One of the main suppliers of weapons to the Mujahideen was Turkey. To counter Soviet forces in Afghanistan, Turkey sent 100 million rounds of ammunition, 60,000 rifles, 8,000 machine guns, and 10,000 pistols. Some Mujahideen groups received assistance from Iran. And here's another astonishing fact about Japan. Japanese military personnel did not participate in the fighting, but Japanese aid allowed Pakistan to become a base for training Mujahideen against Soviet forces. The scale of this support was enormous. From December 1979 to August 1983 alone, Japan provided Pakistan with more than $41 billion in aid. According to updated data, the total losses of the Soviet army in the Afghan war amounted to 14,427 people killed and missing. More than 53,000 people were concussed, wounded, or injured. In roughly the same period of time, the American army in Vietnam lost 47,378 people in combat and another 10,779 dead. More than 152,000 were wounded, and 2,300 went missing. Besides human losses, there are also economic losses. What is the cost of this war? For the Soviet Union, maintaining the army and conducting military operations in Afghanistan cost, according to various estimates, from $3 to $8 billion annually. Another $800 million was allocated to support the Kabul regime. This can be compared to U.S. spending. They spent as much as $165 billion just on the Vietnam War. However, this comparison isn't fully accurate. Besides maintaining the army, you must also consider total economic investment. During the Soviet presence in Afghanistan, the USSR built 2 gas pipelines, several hydro and thermal power plants, power transmission lines, 2 airports, more than 10 oil depots, industrial enterprises, bakeries, clinics, a polytechnic institute, a vocational school, kindergartens, schools, residential neighborhoods, and even weather stations. In total, more than 200 different industrial and social infrastructure facilities. The Soviet Union had invested in Afghanistan's economy well before sending its limited contingent. Huge amounts of money were allocated for the comprehensive development of the Central Asian state. Since the late 1950s, with Soviet assistance, hundreds of major industrial and infrastructure facilities, as well as educational institutions, appeared on Afghan soil. Construction continued during the height of the war, though it became harder for Moscow to provide assistance. The Soviet Union created modern standards of living in Afghanistan for that period, and in recent times, modern Russia wrote off Kabul's debts totaling an unprecedented $11 billion. Just look at this timeline. 1961. 60 years ago, Bagram Airport was built with a 3-kilometer runway. A few years later, Kabul also got an international airport. Most of the paved roads and bridges in Afghanistan were built by the Soviet Union. Soviet builders connected the main economic regions with high-quality roads. The largest project, the Salang Road with its reinforced tunnel, was built by Moscow metro builders at an altitude of over 3,000 meters. During the war, the Mujahideen tried several times to destroy the tunnel but never succeeded. Moscow provided especially valuable assistance in the energy sector. Powerful hydroelectric power stations were built in Naglu, Puli Kumri, the Naglu HPP, and Sevodyas. Today, the Naglu hydroelectric plant is the most powerful power station in Afghanistan. But there still wasn't enough electricity, so the Soviet Union began exporting it from its own borders. For this, a new power transmission line was designed and built. By the pre-war year of 1978, the Soviets had put into operation 70 industrial and transportation facilities in Afghanistan and trained more than 50,000 specialists in various fields. No less than 40% of foreign trade turnover was provided by the Soviet Union, and its share in the total volume of foreign loans was 54%. The Soviet Union exported large quantities of cars and auto parts, ferrous metals, refrigeration equipment, clothing, footwear, medicines, and much more to Afghanistan. The Jangalak repair plant in Kabul repaired almost 1,500 vehicles every year. It also produced machine tools, pumps, and road construction equipment. Already during the war, in 1985, Russian specialists built 3 Kamaz automobile plants. And 2 years later, the Kabul bicycle manufacturing plant. Soviet geologists developed a map of mineral resources in Afghan territory, marking over 1,500 deposits. Afghanistan sold gas to the Soviet Union at a reduced price, but the minor economic effect of this reciprocal step was not comparable to the assistance provided by the USSR. Rather, it was a reliable, guaranteed profit for Afghanistan itself. In addition, Afghanistan supplied the USSR with urea, cotton fiber, stain, carpets, citrus fruits and nuts, and woolen fabrics. In 1980, a contract was signed between the governments for the supply of consumer goods to Kabul free of charge. This aid cost the Union 10 million Soviet rubles annually. In 1963, a polytechnic university was built in Kabul, enrolling 1,200 students in its first year. Kabul Polytechnic is still the leading technical university in Afghanistan today. The construction and electromechanical faculties of Kabul graduate about 4,000 students a year. In 1973, the new technical school in Mazar-e-Sharif began training future oil workers and geologists. The Kabul Technical School trained auto mechanics, and from 1982 to 1986, about a dozen more vocational schools opened their doors. So, how are things going with American construction there? According to statistics, over 12 years the U.S. invested $97 billion into Afghanistan's economy. And since that's just over half the time the American contingent spent in the country, we can roughly estimate the total aid at $200 billion. But no one can say how much of this huge sum was actually used as intended, especially not the Americans themselves. After all, the so-called restoration of the Afghan economy, which was destroyed after the war, never actually happened. In reality, a multi-level corruption scheme was set up to appropriate budget funds, American funds, through Afghanistan. Multi-billion sums simply disappeared without a trace. Here are a few examples of monumental American construction. The Americans built another prison for especially dangerous criminals at the Bagram Air Base, in addition to the one that already existed. The new 3-story prison can hold more than 1,000 inmates, and its construction cost $60 million. Or here's another telling quote. The Pentagon used American money, intended for Afghanistan, to build the most expensive gas station in the world, said John Sopko, head of the Office of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. $43 million were spent between 2011 and 2014 on the construction and maintenance of the gas station, according to official financial documents. Initially, it was supposed to cost only $500. Pro-Western media claimed that it was Charlie Wilson who turned the tide of the war by convincing Ronald Reagan of the need to supply the Mujahideen with portable anti-aircraft missile systems designed to fight helicopters. This myth appeared in the book Charlie Wilson's War and its film adaptation, where Tom Hanks played the congressman. Here's an eloquent shot. Afghan Mujahideen celebrate on top of a Soviet helicopter shot down by an American Stinger. In reality, the Stingers only forced the Soviet troops to change their tactics. The Mujahideen didn't have night vision devices, so the helicopters started operating at night. Pilots launched strikes from high altitudes, reducing accuracy, but Afghan and Soviet aviation loss rates stayed nearly the same as in the first 6 years of the war. The Soviet government made the decision to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan in October 1985. This was before the Mujahideen began receiving Stingers in significant quantities, which only happened in the fall of 1986. An analysis of declassified Politburo meeting protocols shows that any innovations in the armament of the Afghan Mujahideen, including Stingers, were never mentioned as a reason for the troop withdrawal. By the way, here's an interesting fact. The United States, according to various estimates, gave the Mujahideen between 500 and 2,000 portable Stinger surface-to-air missile systems. After the withdrawal of Soviet troops from the country, the American government began buying back the gifted missiles at $183,000 each, while the cost of a Stinger was only $38,000. That's another example of a military bargain. The main factor that undermined Najibullah's position was a statement from Moscow in September 1991, which came soon after the failed coup against Gorbachev. Yeltsin, who came to power, decided to reduce the country's international commitments. Russia announced that it would stop supplying weapons to Kabul, as well as food and any other assistance. This decision was catastrophic for the morale of Najibullah's supporters, whose regime lasted only 2 years after Soviet troops left Afghanistan. Many of Najibullah's military commanders and political allies joined the Mujahideen, who kept receiving U.S. weapons after the Soviet withdrawal. As a result, Najibullah's army was not defeated. It simply melted away. It turned out that Moscow itself, in essence, overthrew the government for which thousands of Soviet lives had been sacrificed. Those are the facts. And if even some of them surprised you, leave some feedback on this episode and give it a fair rating. Maybe we made a mistake somewhere, or you have something to add in the comments. In any case, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in future episodes on our channel.